Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So it's been a couple episodes now, if you're a returning listener or viewer, that I've been talking about doing an episode on U.S. international relations, foreign policy, and military intervention. I've been very trepidatious, shall we say, about doing this episode for a number of reasons. First, I still feel that I personally am in the midst of a bit of an ideological transition and was concerned about presenting a view that wasn't yet solidified. I guess second, for the longest time, I hope to pursue a career in diplomacy, which leads me to a bit of a concern that my views are held too close, if you will, and might lack some nuance as a result. And I guess third, my undergraduate degree in international relations was steeped, shall we say, in many of the classic Eurocentric views of academia in its time, which I railed against, I should say, in my senior year after studying abroad. This precipitated blowback, for lack of better terminology, that almost led me to drop out before my final semester because I felt my views were being ignored and or cast aside by some of my professors because they were outside of the academic mainstream rather than for, at least as I saw it at the time, legitimate reasons, rooted in logic and historical evidence. Ultimately, of course, the truth was more nuanced, and I was so paralyzed by this fear of rejection and failure by the academic establishment that while I barely cobbled together my anti-colonial, anti-imperialist thesis, which had what I maintain are some great ideas, it wasn't my best work either. I tell you all of this so you might understand how difficult the field is to delve into publicly for me, after almost a decade where I was more office and or restaurant worker than foreign policy wonk, especially when my audience, however very small it is, might rail against, to be honest, the heterodoxy of my views on these issues. But I figured that in light of some major developments internationally, it was time for me to throw caution to the wind and do my best to convey what I deeply believe, even if it might frustrate some of my allies. Better to stand behind your convictions, right? So, like I said, I feel like I'm in a bit of an ideological transition on issues of international relations. This is in no small part because I've been thrust into some far left circles on these issues that I had almost no contact with prior to starting the Decent Federalism Project, at DecentFed, PROJ, on Twitter, a little over a year ago. And it's certainly caused me to reevaluate some of my more deeply held beliefs, honestly, probably quite rooted in, establishment academia that, like I say, is pretty Eurocentric. But for a little bit of background, I was essentially raised a neoliberal for most of my life, though I'd say both my family and I have moved left over the course of my life, definitely myself much more so. The first election I was engaged in, which I couldn't vote in, was Bush v. Kerry in 2004. As someone who was basically politically activated by 9/11, while I was basically already convinced Iraq had been the wrong target in response to the terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, I was still convinced that Bush was better equipped to finish the job than John Kerry. So I hope you'll give me a bit of a break. I still wanted to be a biologist at that point in my life. My dreams of becoming a diplomat were still years ahead of me at that point, but hopefully it gives you something of a baseline for my personal political growth. Since then, I've become more anti-colonial and anti-war with every move of our government that I've been witness to around the world. As someone who voted for Obama, I protested his use of drone warfare and maintenance of the war on terrorism. I engaged on African conflicts that were going unnoticed or worse, misrepresented by mainstream press, including but not limited to the Cameroonian Civil War, which started taking place only a few years after I lived there for almost 6 months, with the signs of unrest building while I was there. But before I get to where my views are today, I wanted to tackle some of the ongoing armed conflicts and humanitarian crises going on around the world. So I wanted to start with, I think, what's a decent sort of empirical metric for severity of conflict, which is number of deaths by conflict. And these numbers I'm going to give are approximate and relative, and obviously a lot of numbers around deaths are themselves pretty politicized and can be exaggerated or downplayed in reporting. So take these with a grain of salt. This is just sort of a way of framing the discussion around foreign policy and military intervention. So coming in at number one is the Tigray War, which is taking place in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region. So this exploded this year to reportedly tens of thousands of deaths. Like I say, placing it at number one on the list of deaths for armed conflicts this year. And it is taking place between a once powerful political party that represented the Tigrayan ethnic group, which refused to integrate into a post-ethnic nationalism political coalition with Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And there have been lots of civilian casualties, with rape and sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. And I think you might see at least where I'm starting this off at, which is, despite being the armed conflict with the most deaths this year, or in the last 12 months, it's been pretty sparsely reported on in the U.S. So that brings us to number two, which is I'm taking a little bit of a liberty here by calling this the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan, because a lot of the conflict has boiled over between the two states, with Taliban strongholds in the mountains that span the two countries. But again, so to get back at it, this conflict comes in at number two for deaths in 2021, with a coalition on one side that includes the U.S., and on the other side, the Taliban and elements of the so-called Islamic State. I usually prefer to refer to it in its Arabic name, Daesh. It's looking like the U.S. will leave several thousand contractors there, despite promising to withdraw from the conflict. So it's at a sort of interesting inflection point now, again, where some of the reporting conflicts with the sort of broader messaging around what's going on, how the U.S. is being involved in that conflict. So next up, number three, is the so-called Yemeni crisis, which is taking place between a Houthi movement, which is a minority group of Shia rebels that has taken over Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen. And this is taking place with the Hadi government in exile, which is a Sunni majority government that is basically being operated in exile from Saudi Arabia. So pretty recently, the U.S. has officially ended support for Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and therefore the Hadi government. But thus far, they seem to be continuing to furnish the Saudis with arms that support the Hadi regime. So again, another instance of difference between sort of reporting and knowledge that you can find and the kind of official position of the U.S. So interestingly, hovering around fourth in the list for number of casualties between 2020 and 2021 is the Mexican drug war, in which the U.S. government ostensibly supports the Mexican government in training and consultation, but aside from, as we all know, erecting massive protections, shall we say, from border crossings, hasn't really attempted to address the root causes by helping to end the criminalization of drugs, or assisting in lifting people out of poverty in Mexico or the Northern Triangle, which is where a large number of the refugees that are coming to our border stem from. So that was a really striking number to me to see. That's actually one of the highest numbers of deaths for a conflict in the world right now. And we've just kind of taken that as, while it's obviously politicized by one side or the other, how big an issue it is, the actual number of deaths and the fact that we kind of take it as a norm that this is just an ongoing crisis was striking to me to see the numbers. So rounding out the list for 2020 and 2021 by number of deaths is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which spiked last year as ethnic tensions rose over a disputed region between Armenians and Azeris in the countries of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And then, so the Boko Haram Islamist insurgency of Nigeria and similar Islamist insurgencies that are tied to the Islamic State that are kind of going on throughout the Sahel region of North Africa. And finally, coming in around number 7, depending on your year of reference and your metric, is the Syrian civil war between the long-standing government of the Assad family and numerous groups that oppose the government, but also often each other, with varying degrees of support, including Russian support often for Assad and Western support for certain rebels against the Assad regime, as well as Turkish support for different rebels against the Assad regime. There are almost too many factions to name here, but as with most wars, no side appears blameless. So I'd like to compare that sort of set of data of the crises where there are a lot of casualties, varying degrees of reporting, a large degree of politicization around what gets through to the mainstream media versus what's reported independently versus what the U.S. government what message the U.S. government is sending. And so I wanted to contrast that with, I'll sort of use the umbrella term for, humanitarian crises and I guess escalating tensions with comparatively smaller losses of life that are nevertheless terrible and need to be, addressed in some form by some parties. And so we'll just get into those briefly. So North Korea is still conducting missile and nuclear tests and has recently showcased a set of new weapons, including a new submarine-launched ballistic missile that was paraded out, I believe it was in January of this year, which it claimed could deliver a nuclear warhead and reach anywhere in the continental U.S. They also had some new missile tests that went into Japanese waters in late March. And obviously, with all these tests, it's always a question of is it an actual direct military action or is it just a test? I think we've come to a point where we just assume that it's a test, and that's kind of the stalemate that we're at with North Korea. But nevertheless, worth bringing up that this is a repressive regime that keeps the country in a relative state of indoctrination and removed from the world and all those things, right, which we know to be the case, and many things we don't, right, by virtue of the lack of information getting into and out of that country. So next we have Ukraine. So this has been not a very deadly crisis in the last couple of years, but over the course of the incursions, including the annexation of Crimea in recent years, has gotten to over 10,000 at least for the number of casualties. But in recent years, in the last couple of years, the war in Donbass with separatists, which is being propagated by separatists that are backed by Russia against Ukraine. And then military buildup of, I believe the number is 85,000 Russian troops in occupied Crimea and other oblasts, which is just like their word for provinces that border Ukraine, which has been happening. This buildup has been happening in March and April of this year. And obviously, we can get into the other sort of fraught politics between Ukraine and Russia and the U.S. But suffice it to say, these are real things that are really happening. These two that I've talked about, the war in Donbass, which is an ongoing crisis between Ukraine and Russia, along with, of course, the military buildup that I just mentioned. Okay, so that brings us to the Uyghur detainment camps. So as many as 2 million Uyghur Muslims, which is an ethnic group in Western China, are being detained in the Chinese province of Xinjiang, with reports of everything from forced assimilation through re-education, is how some put it, to much worse things like forced abortions and sterilization. This is an ongoing, independently documented problem, and I'll come back to the Uyghur problem shortly. And then the last one that I want to address in this kind of second section is Israel-Palestine. So very recently, approximately 22 people were killed in Gaza, including 9 children, with Israeli airstrikes, which were preceded by rockets from Hamas, which in turn was preceded by a raid by Israeli police to disrupt a Palestinian protest inside and near Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, where more than 300 Palestinians were injured. And concurrent and proximal in time to the Al-Aqsa raid was a violent enactment of a court-ordered eviction of Palestinians by Israeli police in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, using tear gas, stun grenades, and batons. So this is obviously just one episode that happened over the weekend to the current time that I'm recording, which is Monday, May 10th. And this is just an episode in the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict over what territory, if any, should Palestinian Arabs and other minority groups be entitled to in the Israeli state after the creation of the Israeli state in the late 1940s. But this is, a very long-standing crisis with many, many deaths over decades. But suffice it to say, these are, 4 conflicts, if you will, where the numbers of deaths in recent years are either unknown, comparably low to the first sort of set I gave you, or they're both unknown and comparably low. Unclear, right? So this brings us to, the question of what motivates the crises, the conflicts, the violence, which we choose to report, and the conflicts, by contrast, that we don't. So in the U.S., I think it's fair to say we have a sort of small set of foreign policy boogeymen, if you will. The most notable of them being today, I would say, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And Iraq used to be on that list prior to the invasion of Iraq, under the premise that the false premise, I should say, that Saddam Hussein, the leader at the time, was hiding weapons of mass destruction and had ties to Al-Qaeda. So no longer considered part of the axis of evil, right, that was espoused by George W. Bush. In fact, the president there, I believe, is directly supported by the U.S. government at this time. Right, so we've got those 4 foreign policy boogeymen: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And then we have 2 sort of non-state, I guess, boogeymen that we use as a country in the U.S., which is, the specter of Islamist terrorism, of which, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the so-called Islamic State, as well as, Iran is obviously has been labeled a state sponsor of terrorism by the U.S. for some time. But these sort of non-state actors are, a part of the foreign policy discourse and what is used to justify military intervention by the U.S. And then the last one is socialism, right? With Venezuela and Cuba being 2 sort of examples of powers that we've said, okay, well, we have to intervene or risk coming to blows with these countries because we see them as a military threat because of the ills of socialism, right, as they see it. And I always like to, interject this disclaimer, which is that I don't claim the label of socialism for myself, but I think that we are in an era of U.S. politics where socialism is resurgent, I guess, as a policy or as a platform for politicians in the U.S. I believe public opinion of socialism is remarkably high in the U.S. right now. So it's worth discussing. When the U.S. political establishment continues to sort of rail against socialism, and yet we have this large group, I should say, of U.S. citizens that have a favorable or more favorable view of socialism. It raises the question: why are those two things, at odds? So I bring up these boogeymen because, like I said, with my exposure to more leftist views on foreign policy, one of the things that I've been forced to reconsider is the ways in which we use these boogeymen unfairly and to justify intervention or even just adversarial stances on foreign policy that we don't necessarily have to, right? It's a foreign policy choice to say Russia and China and Iran and North Korea are our biggest rivals, biggest potential sources of unrest, and challenges to American democracy, as they would say, right? And interestingly, Islamist terrorism has taken a bit of a dive in terms of how much it factors into our foreign discourse, in no small part, I imagine, because just about around, depending on your measurements, 2 decades of the quote-unquote war on terrorism. So this is clearly waning as a justifiable source of interventionism, right, by the U.S. military. So I guess where the rubber hits the road, if you will, and where I might differ with some leftists is the degree to which I think that there are some reasonable justifications for labeling these foreign powers as areas of concern, right? I think among the left there is a contingent that tends to downplay, what's going on in Ukraine right now, what happened in Crimea with regard to Russia, or what's going on with the Uyghurs. I've encountered a surprising number of sort of, Uyghur truthers, if you will, that suggest that nothing's going on, or nothing of concern is going on in Western China, and it doesn't justify a response. And I've got to just come out and say it. These are real things, right? And they're empirically provable things. And whether the source of information is more difficult to find, or the truth behind the information has been, it sits under some layers of propaganda. The annexation of Crimea happened, right? This was an intervention on sovereign soil. And we can obviously have a large discussion about, the relevance of nation states and the degree to which they matter or should matter in international policy, in the way we operate as a species. But these are things that are indeed happening, and it surprises me a little bit that I have to say that. And like I say, this is part of the reason why I struggled with how to come out with this episode, because I want to engage with those parts of the left that are struggling with the idea, that see the propaganda that lays over top of this, that might exaggerate the threat that Russia, for example, poses. But I believe we have to engage in more nuance on the left about what's going on in these countries that, because of certain political views, we might want to lay aside certain issues and say, well, these aren't strictly relevant. But the honest truth is that a lot of them are relevant. And so that's the first thing that I wanted to really get at, is that that these are real threats. Now, the degree of the threats, right, matters hugely, and that's an ongoing conversation, right? And there's a reason why I list them as boogeymen, right? Because we do overuse them to justify authorization of use of military force that isn't, done through Congress. That's done under the power of the executive. That should, in fact, go through Congress, and that's also a pivotal, crucial line of inquiry to go through. Is to what degree should we be going through Congress? Should every military action go through Congress except for an incursion directly on U.S. soil? And that's a worthwhile conversation that I would love to have, but probably outside the scope of what I wanted to address today. But I guess when it gets down to it, when it comes to my views on foreign policy today, the fact is that any attempt to defend or expand democracy around the world as the U.S., whether through military intervention or diplomacy, will ring at least somewhat hollow until we get our democracy in order at home. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't aspire to more and better democracy, both at home and abroad. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't play a part in trying to stop major amounts of death. At the end of the day, I believe that the pivotal question is, shouldn't we engage in coalition building to find ways to liberate Uyghurs, Yemenis, Ukrainians, and Palestinians? We can leave behind the era of installing and supporting authoritarians and encourage people to build real democracies without bloodshed. So I guess, with this groundwork that I've laid, the big decent idea of the day is to build a post-NATO, post-UN alliance of real democracies, of which the US would aspire to be one. This would be a force that is strong enough to deter conflict and undemocratic behavior, fostering real democratization as well as hold its own responsible when they stray from real democratic norms. And as with an increasing number of episodes of late, this becomes more possible with a decentralized US, where democratization at home is more likely to increase, that would allow us to credibly act as a superpower that fosters democracy. And as I've plugged a couple of times, please check out decentfedproject.org to learn more about that framework that I'm working to build. But I wanted to come out today and as I said in the intro, really start to pick apart some of these things that I think the left tends to gloss over in favor of principles that I definitely support. We should avoid military intervention when possible. We should engage in diplomatic efforts in good faith with groups that we don't like, with actors that we don't like. But we also can't pretend that we don't have some responsibility when we have the size of the military we have to at least try and do it in coalition, right? At least try and stop mass amounts of death where they occur. And I get that that's a hard line to draw, and it's not always clear, fog of war, fog of conflict, and all that jazz. But as we think as the left about, the degree to which we should scale down our military, should focus our resources elsewhere, it's still a conversation worth having about, is there any relevance for our powerful military, any use that we should be putting it towards that could create more good in the world? And I get that that's gonna ruffle some feathers on the left among my listeners, but I wanted to be forthright with you about my views, and hopefully I've at least started to make the case for why we need some engagement, why we can't withdraw completely. And while I do support, for example, the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan in total, because this is such a quagmire at this point that there's no reason to remain there. We need to reevaluate our strategy and determine How do we support regular Afghanis? How do we engage with Islamist extremism? And by the way, I make the differentiation between Islamist and Islamic, because that's actually an important distinction that's worth getting into if you want to do some Googling. It really is. But, we also have to get to the root causes, right? The war in Afghanistan has historical roots that trace back to us arming Afghani rebels against the Soviet Union. So we have to reconcile with our history there and determine, what is the right way to move forward and what is the right way to de-escalate extremism that we've certainly had a role in fostering and continue to foster to this day. And, I could go into any number of the other examples we went through today, with what's going on in Yemen and the fact that we really need to withdraw our support for Saudi Arabia as a whole, that we've engaged in a huge double standard about, Iran we think is a state sponsor of terrorism, but Saudi Arabia is doing a comparable amount of damage in the Middle East to what might otherwise be burgeoning democracies. The Rojava movement is one such movement that I've been digging into a little bit and would love to come back to in a future episode. But we've got to, like I say, engage in the nuance. And, I support a strong amount of the, leftist ideas for, like I say, getting out of the war in Afghanistan, getting out of the crisis in Yemen, doing more for the Palestinian people against Israel instead of often being the supporter for Israel against what is a much weaker force there. But we also have to, as always, engage with the facts and not be influenced by what fits our political narrative. And this is starting to feel like a bit of a lecture to my leftist folks. But, I hope you'll keep in mind that I come from a background of fighting a neo-colonial imperialist establishment in my advocacy, in my academic work. And so I want to try and find that new balance. And hopefully I don't come off as an imperialist in trying not to do that and trying to get at the facts. But thank you so much for listening. And I'd really love to engage in conversation with you. So please find me at DecentFed, PROJ, on Twitter to have a discussion. If you're on YouTube, please engage in the comments and let's have some, hopefully the start of some discourse. And who knows, you might influence me to go further left and to be even less open to the idea of military intervention anywhere. We can have a further conversation about regime change, wars, and all of those things. But hopefully I've provided a little bit of an overview here. As I like to say, depending on how you're taking this in, you should know that the podcast is available on YouTube by searching Decent Federalism Project, and on most audio podcast platforms by searching Decent Ideas Podcast. Next time, we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue that deserves a new set of eyes. My plan is to zoom further in on colonialism and neocolonialism, focusing more on Israel-Palestine, as well as the so-called scramble for Africa, the Cold War's impact on the Middle East, and US-backed coups around the world. But until then, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well, and thanks so much for listening.